Bibles to 1 Peter and the second chapter. We'll be reading from verses 1, 2, and 3, not getting too much out of the field of that smaller text. Before we get into our study, though, it's good for us to gather our hearts together and begin with prayer. So, if you would bow with me at this time. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the blessings that we share in Jesus. We thank you for the relationship that exists between disciples, and we hope that our hearts grow and mature in ways that help us understand our place in this world, the challenges that are before us, and the ways in which you equip us to be faithful, zealous, and encouraging to each other. Please watch over our souls and forgive us of our sins, and we offer this prayer in the name of your Son. Amen. All right, so we have a second half, if you will, of a two-part idea. We had a bit of looking into a similar idea with our lesson last week. Of course, it's kind of obvious that they're going to all be tied together this way. But last week when we were looking at the closing parts of 1 Peter chapter 1, we kind of focused in on the idea of being who you are as a disciple, as a sojourner, as a follower of Jesus. This is a bit of a shift in the same area, and it talks about how to become who you are. And there's a shift in emphasis that takes place. Two things are important as we consider both of those passages. Peter writes from a perspective that is first very individual or personal, but his larger message turns into the corporate, the congregate, the church, the community, the tribe, the people. And so he uses phrases and words that change that language from one to many in different ways. And you'll see that in a couple of small details. One of the ones is the shift in pronouns that we all kind of pay attention to when we're carefully reading. Much like we noticed in the Gospel of Luke in the book of Acts, when Luke shows up because he changes his grammar, Peter does a bit of the same thing. That's not new to writers. We do that too. I just did that right there on purpose. But I said we did that rather than I do that. So this kind of careful reading is important for us to catch those small details we never noticed before, or to properly contextualize a passage. That is, place it in the right setting, to the right people, etc. One of the most important tools when reading the Bible is speed. If you slow down, and that's a personal challenge right there, if you slow down and read it carefully, very often you find things you missed because you were reading it too fast for all kinds of personal reasons. So right now, let's try to read this together carefully. And Michael, if you would, could you read verses 1, 2, and 3 for us of the second chapter? 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 1, 2, and 3.
Therefore, putting aside all malice, and all deceit, and all hypocrisy, and envy, and all slander, like newborn babies, long for the pure milk of the word, so that by it you may grow in respect to salvation, if you have tasted the kindness of the Lord.
So over the years, and I think I did a few of lessons here at different times at Eastside, I've used not an inductive approach, but a quizzical approach to the scriptures, where I ask people to pay attention to the 1, 2, or 3 verses by themselves, and just kind of pretend that that's all you know. If this was all that you had ever heard from God, if these 3 verses were the only things you had ever seen, and you weren't even quite sure who they were written to, what they were written about, what kind of things do we learn? And the terminology I use is just say, what's in a verse? And so usually it's one verse, sometimes it's a little passage. So when you look at this passage, thus these 3 verses, what kind of questions do you have or things that you learn just from this singular text?
question was stated when I looked at the first verse. Well, no, it is a question. How much of this was in my life and how much of this is in my life?
So you've gone personal with it, which is one of the directions that goes, hey, is this written to me? And I always come away, at least, and this is part of my process, with some structural things. Because it begins with a conjunction, that means, hey, there's something before it. Like, this is not the whole thing. It's missing something. There's questions being asked at the end. So I'm like, what's the tone or the context of this? The ESV reads it, if indeed you have tasted that the Lord is good. So I write that down. Like, what's this question all about? This means that there's some potential action that either has or has not taken place. What else? Pretending that this is the only passage that you've ever seen before. And that's a difficult task. Like, our prejudices with ideas are part of our process. And so it's a challenge there. But what else?
Well, I think to me, I kind of wonder sometimes it kind of lumps stuff together instead of picking out individual stuff. And to me, that first verse is just saying, be a good person.
Right, like, I remember a while back I saw this in a larger set of information that a lot of Christian behavior, that is Christ-like interaction, is stuff you should have learned in kindergarten. Now, we grow up and we forget that lesson, and we unfortunately justify a lot of other stuff. The clearest example of that, and every family did this to a differing degree. In your family, if someone told you when you were under the age of 5 that they were drinking an adult beverage, it could have been alcohol, but it also could have been soda or anything with caffeine, depending on your household. Because you don't necessarily want to sugar up or caffeine up a little kid. No, you can't have that. Because some families wouldn't let their little kids have soda, caffeinated beverages, or certain ones due to biological or physiological concerns. They had different chemicals in them that might have been allergy issues for them. And so that's for grown-ups, right? Well, we did that with behavior too. We'd even do that socially. What's the difference between a G-rated movie and a PG 11, 12, 13, or whatever categories they use right now? Language is the first thing that slips in. And not so much the words someone shouldn't say, but the concepts get sharper and more piercing. Sometimes there are subject matter that gets dealt with that requires a higher level of emotional, cognitive thinking. Like, it might deal with history in a more open way. It might deal with sorrow and pain and hurt in more open ways. And it's like, no, that's more adult. So when I go back to this text here in verse 1, and I start thinking about it, God, the writer, inspiration, together are saying, so put away malice, deceit, hypocrisy, envy, and all slander. It indicates that the writer thinks that maybe they haven't done that. Possibly this is not going the way it should. And ask yourself this question underneath that. These are Christians who used to be worshiping together closely, and now they're not because they've been spread across the entire region surrounding Turkey and beyond. If you knew a person was full of malice, slander, deceit, envy, hypocrisy, how much time do you want to spend with them? Are they going to make it on your close friend invite list to your party? And yet, this is the group that he's writing to, who were united not only by potential family ties, but by a family united in Christ. And I challenge you to think about it this way. Les rightly pointed out that this should be adult human behavior, things that we should know, we should learn. When you're honest with yourself, how many times has this actually been your challenge for today? Like any day that ends in Y, right? You say, well, wait a minute, I'm not dishonest. I don't slander. We just call it different things. We redefine behavior. We use the concept that's throughout the Bible and our current speech. We soften it by making it have a different name. So when someone dies, what are some of the Bible euphemisms that exist to describe that? Sleep, right? What's another one? Past. Or, Old Testament in particular, it uses a theological idea of going to be with their fathers. Plural at the end. Not father, but fathers. Or, using Romans 6, we might say it's burial. And that's euphemistically connected to death as well, right? Those are all euphemisms designed to take a more plain, stark, or challenging term and soften it. So we do that with slander sometimes, or deceit, or malice. And it's always something we have to be mindful of. I didn't mean for you to be hurt by this. I was just being funny, or making an observation. Or the one that I find most challenging at times, I'm just being real. My response usually when someone comes up and says something that's hurtful and that says, I'm being real, well, you're just being real hurtful. Like, it still hurts. Well, I'm just being honest. Honest isn't a salve for mean. And I pick at myself like that as an illustration. This is my illustration I use. And you can say this back to me. This is permission to do this. Do my clothes make me fat, or does my fat make me fat? What's the answer? There's only one correct answer. My fat makes me look fat, not my clothes. Right? Now, you can say what you want to each other in that regard, but I'm giving you free permission to reuse that joke in my direction without any kind of hurt, because I know who I am, and I know what's going on. I'm a big, galoof, and it's okay for me. But we live in a world that takes something that's a concrete thing and tries to reshape it and make part of it not bad, but kind of okay. So when you think about this, again, all malice, all deceit, hypocrisy, envy, and slander, our minds immediately go to the furthest, more harsh examples of it and say, absolutely don't do that. And we kind of skip the middle ground, which unfortunately is where all of us live, and go, well, I'm working on it. Fair. It's fair to say you're working on it, but don't stay there. Because, and I love the way that this particular text illustrates this, and I'm going to make it a couple of quick connections too. Verse 2 says what? How should we become? Yeah, like newborn babes. But in what way? Because for those who have been in households with newborn babes, or who have seen families who have recently brought a child into their house, is everything about a newborn child wonderful? Not really. None of my kids are here. Carson, you didn't hear this, but you can. It doesn't involve James, so we're okay. I remember like the first time they were really sick as a little bit older, and the choice was, because they were about to throw up, my hands or the floor and the shoes below my hands. Now, parents, what choice did I make? Parents, what choice? Where's that throw up go? It goes straight up in your hands, right? Why does that happen? I'm not cleaning that floor another time. I'm kind of done with that. I can wash my hands. Really, just go. Just let's see what happens, right? Because at that point, I think I cleaned the floor like 4 times. They just physically couldn't make it to the bathroom fast enough. After that, like, you're in the bathtub. You're just going to exist in the bathtub, all right? Until we're done through this circumstance and everything's kind of purged out of you, right? That's not pleasant. It's not the wonderful parts of things. It's a part of a newborn child to a certain degree. It's part of those things. But it says in this particular case, long for something. And Peter is using a picture here. It says, for the pure spiritual milk, so that you grow. It says, this is like a known, natural thing. That babies need sustenance. And he says, they long for it. Because kids cry for a number of reasons, but predominantly they cry because they're hungry, sleepy, or the obvious one's the third. Wet, right? Then it falls into that last category. They hurt. Babies cry because they're not comfortable. And that's their only way to interact. And it might be their teeth. It might be their body. It might be that they're wet. And when those things are alleviated, it's a very small amount of things that are left. All right? But they long for something that will make them satisfied. Bobby?
Seems like it's going to adjust your attitude. And that's something we have to do the rest of our lives.
Right. This is something we all continually grow through, and there's a great connection that's being made here. Peter continues and says, if indeed you have tasted. Like this clause there. How many of you are familiar with the Old Testament story involving Naaman and his baptism? Guys, it's a shake or nod moment, right? Most of us are kind of familiar with that Old Testament, whole dialogue that takes place. You've got a soldier from far away. He thinks he has to do some great, amazing thing. And what's he told to do? Go to the Jordan River, get in it 7 times, just dip in it. Now, the Jordan looked a little better then than it does now. But picture, if you will, Line Creek, all right? How many of you guys have walked by Line Creek over there by the edge? You walk by there? All right, so picture that on a rainy day. Because on a dry day, it's kind of clear. But on a rainy day, it's a brown river, right? Full of soot and soil. That's kind of how the Jordan looks a lot. Because of the dynamics of the river, it churns up that way. So go to that one. How about the far part of the Arabah? He was applying adult human wisdom and thinking that's not good enough. He, in essence, had to become obedient like a child would be and simply accept the instructions with a convicted heart and say, this is what God told me to do. Do it 7 times, then I'll be well. So to throw away, by our illustrations earlier, all of our euphemisms, all of our softening of these expectations, all of the excuses that we make to ourselves. Well, they needed to hear it. I'm just being real. All that kind of stuff with our speech as an example. And be an infant. And just long for what God has said. Just desire it so deeply and fundamentally that I'll do that. That's where Bobby's comment regarding a change in attitude takes place. Because it shifts the way we see what's necessary. The New Testament talks often about, in regards to some of these areas, how we do a thing in line with the thing. So our speech is to be seasoned with what? Salt. And what's the contextual application of this salt? Besides salt being good, like everyone likes a little salt in their dish, what's the salt actually representing in that context, if you can remember?
Makes it easier to take.
Yeah. And we also, the accommodative idea that's surrounded it is graciousness, with grace. Remembering contextually that you yourself are a recipient of grace. And so your speech becomes gracious. And this is not a I have perfected it thing. This is I am perfecting it. To those of you who consider themselves good to excellent cooks, whatever you want to use as your standard, do you cook all your dishes exactly the same way you learned them? How many of you actually have shifted from either always using measuring tools to not using them at all, or the other direction? Like, there are some dishes, like, come again, raise your hand, like some dishes for barbecue and stuff, where I used to carefully measure, like a scale, by weight to determine the spices. All right? Where now, with some practice and experience, you know what I can do? I know. I just know. I know exactly how much to cut off of the brisket to achieve most likely what my outcome is going to be. I know exactly how much of that to put on. Even if the brisket changes in size, yeah, I'm just eyeballing it with wisdom, with experience, with perspective. So, we know this happens in all the rest of our lives. It happens here too. So if our goal as believers is to grow spiritually while we are in the process of casting off malicious and awful and poor and evil behavior, then we're going to actually be applying what it is that Peter is asking for us to become. Become similar to the newborn babe who longs for the milk of the Word. And that's an ongoing challenge. Most of us struggle to be disciplined with about anything. It doesn't matter who you are. Think about it this way. How many of you have been motivated to learn a new thing before? Like you say, I want to learn this new thing because I need to learn it, right? How long does that motivation last? It's a small thimbleful of motivation. And eventually you might even forget what it was that motivated you to learn that. But then it's kind of washed over by this idea of discipline. Because discipline always is the thing that actually makes us finish a thing. I don't like running at all, period. And again, if you ever see me running, don't ask questions. What's the right response if I'm running? Join in. Because there's a very good reason. Because I'm running away from something really bad or to something really good. Like that's it. There's no middle ground. All right? But I know a lot of my friends who are just dedicated, die-hard runners. I don't understand it at all. Even at the points in my life where physically I was not joint impaired and could run, I still never liked it. But all of them uniquely identify that for them to get where they're at, it's taken mostly discipline and spurts of motivation. All right? That's how all the areas of our life function, where it's no longer about the thing that I was motivated to do, but discipline has now produced some results. Here's some results to kind of put it back into context for you. We can balance it out of the physical realm back into the interpersonal and spiritual realm. Multiple doctors over the years have pointed this out to me, and you can also read about it in lots of standardized medical studies. But if you walk 1 to 2 miles a day, just walk. Not run anymore, just walk. You add years to your life. Like mathematically, you just live longer. And not just longer, but better. Now walking's a lot easier, right? Than running? Absolutely. So just walking a little bit every day, getting up to 2 miles as a goal, but starting with walking a mile a day. Walking, not running. You live longer. What does the generalized texts of Proverbs say regarding our speech and behavior? Generally speaking, what does Proverbs tell us about how we talk to people? This is where you can give a summary answer. There's a simple one. Don't be dumb, all right, in your speech. Actually, a couple times it says don't be stupid, is a correct rendition of Proverbs. In particular, it talks about learning to use wisdom in your speech, being careful. It talks about relationally, that your speech can function like the sharpening stone, as one man can sharpen another by the way they talk to each other. We've noted in Ecclesiastes that ties into the text of Proverbs that your speech will help you bind your relationships together and be stronger together. Now, apply that in the context of both behavior and speech to 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 1, and how we treat one another with how we talk. You ever see someone interact with another person and envy is obvious in the way that they talk to one another? You ever seen Christians behave that way? Careful now. Because when I say Christians, that means you and me. And let me add one more phrase. You ever gone home and realize that what you just said that day was that? See, it's easy when it's, I'll see it happen. Like you want to see bad parenting, go to Safeway, that's for the West Coasters, go to Walmart and go in the grocery aisles and then go into the cashier aisles. And well, nobody knows how to parent right there, right? But someone's been watching you when your kid was doing the same thing that you're upset about. Because you forget the problem wasn't there. The problem's, remember our 3 problems for kids? They're hungry, they're tired, they got to go to the bathroom. And never happens at the right time. So you go back to this and you think about, okay, it's not somebody else, it's not just my brethren, it's me, and speech is the easiest step in identifying it. But let me make one more connector in there. Let's say we remove all the speech that is questionable. First layer, we peel off all of the curse words. And by the way, those words will change generationally. Curse words for those who are older than me are far different than curse words for those who are younger than me. But let's peel all of them off. So we figured out what those are. We've got our words we can't say list, and we're actually really good at it. Now we've improved, and now we say things with more grace taking that space, because that's what's going to happen when we fill our lives with the Word. We're going to be more gracious or salty in the biblical sense in our speech. Can we still be full of malice and envy if our speech, if the things we say are cleaned up? Yeah. How many of you are uncomfortable when you're in a situation, here's the illustration of it, where the people you're interacting with make a whole lot more money than you, or make what you think is a lot less money than you? And the same thing applies to above. You ever get uncomfortable when you're around millionaires? Do you realize you don't know that you're around millionaires? Most of the folks I know who are very successful at various jobs, you just don't know. And because of math and property values, millionaires exist all the time in our county. I'm so baffled by real estate prices, they don't make logical sense to me at times. But every home in the Coweta County in the last 5 years has about doubled in property value. That means, realistically, especially if they have their home paid off, a lot of folks are millionaires. I don't know why. Just is. I mean, I know why. There's all kinds of reasons. But you think about that. They're the same person they were before or after. But we have struggles going either direction. And being around someone who, for whatever reason, doesn't present themselves as being wealthy also makes us uncomfortable at times. Why don't you care about the things that I care about? Why don't you care about your 401k or your house or whatever? You don't seem to be bothered by this and that way. I'm uncomfortable now. In fact, it seems like something's wrong with you that you don't care about what I care about or think about what I think about. Or, and this is where the dagger comes in, I think there's something wrong with your faith because you don't care about them the way that I do. And that can go in both directions. That can go from someone who has little to someone who has a lot. But the Bible actually puts heavier weights on those who have a lot as they see those who have little. A lot of pressure placed on those who have a lot of this world's goods to be generous, kind, and compassionate to those who do not. And when you think about malice and envy in particular, the first easy dagger to put in your heart is the one that involves stuff. But it isn't just that. Sometimes it's lifestyle and relationships. How many of you at different, and I'll speak personally, in high school were like me and at times felt like you had no friends? I felt like that in high school as one who at different times was highly involved in basketball and football. I was a drum major my senior year of the marching band. I was involved in numerous clubs. I never ate alone at lunch. As a freshman, they thought I was a senior. There's other reasons for that. I blended in because I was a ginormous kid. But then all of a sudden, I was the only ginormous kid as the seniors vanished, and I became bigger than everybody else. Didn't feel like I had friends. And I would see people who I perceived as having all these friends. And what do you think I did as a teenager? There's our E word that we just read, right? I was envious of those relationships. I wanted those relationships. I didn't want to go out and party. I didn't want to go out and get drunk. I didn't want to cause chaos. I didn't want to go break the law. I just wanted friends who had a view of the world that was somewhat similar to mine and enjoyed doing the same things that I kind of enjoyed doing. And so you think about envy now. It's gone from physical stuff. I can conceptualize that pretty easily to envy over relationships. One more difficult step. What about that period of life after that? And I can speak a little bit about this too. Although in retrospect, it's not a big deal anymore. When all your friends got engaged and got married and you weren't on the same schedule as they were. If there is a role or a job to do at a wedding besides the groom or the bride's party, obviously, I've done that job. I did them all before I even met Jill. More than once. And there's actually a communal thing for the Martin family that if we get invited to help out for a wedding, Martin boys, we know how to park cars. Jesse was just involved in a wedding out in Texas. You know what he did? Park cars. He was a groomsman, also involved in parking cars. We show up to weddings, we park cars. Or we help with the food. This is what we do. Happy to do it. But you don't think, as a young man, watching my buddies all get married, that was hard? I got a buddy of mine who's married, raising his family now. He went for it longer. I got married in my mid-20s. He got married when he was 30. Hard emotionally on someone who desires a relationship and a family, but also has a personality that's waiting for the right match in personality. Someone who is a balance to what they are. Envy and malice can come because what's the human behavior? What do we do in those situations when envy and malice and slander start coming in? What do they have that I don't? And our mind shifts the needle from, I want to get something, that's how we justify it, just like that. When all we're trying to make sure we don't say is, I want that. Right? I want what they have. And we qualify it and quantify it and say, oh, I just want what they have. It's really close to I want what they have. Right? I want to take it from them. Does the Bible give any illustrations in the Old Testament or New Testament of broken relationships because you took something that wasn't yours? Yeah, pretty common, especially all the familiar relationships of the Davidic line. Everybody's trying to take what everybody else has by force, by intrigue, by slander, by misstatement. And every generation deals with it exactly the same way. 100%. For those of you who have grandkids, do you not understand them sometimes? Like, do you understand why they like what they like, or even some of the things they say to you, like some of the words? Like, what does that even mean? Grandkids who still have relationships because of age or whatever, do your grandparents or have your grandparents said things and you go, I have no idea what that, why are you talking that way? I actually had to go for a translation a couple months, it's probably longer than that. And I think Carson was actually in the class at the time. Carson, you're on the spot. You have to remember this. They helped me connect the dots for the phrase Riz. Carson, you remember that? He does, all right? So Riz is a pop culture term. And Carson, what does it actually refer to? Can you bring it out again? It starts with a C.
Oh, charisma.
Charisma, right? How many of us who are a little bit older know what charisma is? Right, we all know what charisma is. But the youth of the day, the youths, Riz. He's got a lot of Riz. Now it all makes sense, right? It's like, oh, I've been hearing this phrase around, like, okay. Now it makes sense, right? This intergenerational context is something that's natural, but it manifests itself in one last awful way. Because no matter what, generationally and individually, we act like we know what we're doing in all kinds, in all places. And we act like we got it all figured out. In reality, we're all just bumbling along. So as an older generation, and I'm kind of the middle child in that sense. I got people older than me and younger than me. I'm like the middle kid and 3 kids. Older generation looks downward and says, look at all that dumb stuff they're doing. Guess what the younger generation does in the opposite direction? Look at all that dumb stuff they did. And we're cleaning up their mess that they left for us. Like, how come they couldn't figure this out? Because every generation is full at different levels and at different times with malice, deceit, hypocrisy, envy, and slander. And so we develop an interaction that is far too often hypercritical of others rather than being somewhat altogether gracious towards others. And even, and this is probably where it hurts the most, gracious to ourselves. Because if you want to be seasoning everybody else with some salt, speech that's gracious, you got to admit that you need the grace first because you made the mess first. That's hard. It's hard to admit that you're the one who's the problem. Especially when you've had some wins in the past. I got this kind of figured out. Like, I can pay my bills now on time. I can build relationships. I've developed a work ethic that is successful. And I've become productive spiritually and physically. There's that point where you recognize, though, that I still got some work to do. And I think this is partly what we've kind of all keyed into in this text, that this message is written to Christians who have made some success, but still have work to do. And since we can see it in these other relationships in our lives, both inside the community of Christ, but also externally as we interact with people around the world in different ways, this helps us better understand how we can apply what is, in the end, a fairly simple expectation. behave in a healthy or good way. Explicitly or specifically, malice, deceit, slander, and envy are illustrations of it, but not exclusive. Because these are all kind of latched words. If you think about the works of the flesh as a corollary to this, you'll notice that these phrases essentially appear in that work list, but that work list stretches the boundaries and always has the last clause to it. Things like these. It's never an exclusive list. It's only these things. I think in a lot of ways, that's a way for us to better appreciate and understand who we are. A few minutes left for class. You all can have a seat anywhere you want. You don't have to stand unless you want to stretch your legs. You've been driving a while. That's fine too. Any last things you liked in the text, things that challenge you, stuff you might want to know more about?
All these things we just talked about that makes a person not a good person are things that challenge us all our life.
Yeah.
Because they're such human traits.
There's a cycle that exists in our development where we can toss out bitterness in our being and life pours it back in. We can find joy and then lose it again. We can eradicate behavior from one part of our life and we've ignored leaven elsewhere where it grows back up. And it kind of repopulates within us. What else? Or anything else? Donna?
We all have a choice in life. And if you choose to have malice and deceit and hypocrisy in your life, it will be there. You have to choose not to have it in your life.
Yeah. Almost all, and I say almost all because I want to be careful, of behavior is choice. We respond to a thing. And we respond out of the wellspring of whom we've developed within ourselves. That's why you see one event affect 10 people differently. And none of their responses are limited to their upbringing and their current context. There's a basket full of things we bring to those events. And it could be something good or something bad, but we respond to it with a choice that comes after the event. Some of us respond with, I got to fix it. Some of us respond with, that just happened, that's a big thing. I need a minute. And that might be anger, it could be sorrow, it could be whatever, it could be joy because it's a good thing. And gradually we process through those things. And the Bible shows a number of illustrations of that, and there's also physiological aspects too. So that choice comes in that stepping process. That's it for our time this morning. We'll be continuing in the text of 1 Peter, picking up in verse 4 next Sunday. Thanks, everybody.